Hello, everybody. Welcome to Season 1, Episode 1 of Fluent Friends. This is your host, Banai, and that is your co-host,
Nick.
We are talking about movie genres.
Why did we choose genres for our first episode?
Movies make an easy conversational piece, and knowing what kind of genres the movies belong to helps us visualize what we're talking about, and I feel like it makes the communication just that much more effective.
Yeah, it's a common topic, and it's something that you probably find yourself speaking about with a whole bunch of different people, whether they be friends, coworkers, somebody you just met at the 7-Eleven. So I think, yeah, it's a common topic, and we hope that this conversation will provide a little bit more depth to your vocabulary and your knowledge of the subject.
If you're talking about movies, the first thing you should probably mention is the categories that they belong to. And notice I say categories because a movie may belong to multiple genres.
All right, so Benai, tell me, what is a genre?
Literally, a genre is a category of a kind of art. So movie genre is a category of movies that have similarities, whether it is in stories or visual effect or even the way they make people feel. The same word can be also used for music, book, and different kinds of art.
So, what can you find in this episode? We're going to discuss common movie genres and what makes them special, what's similar, within those certain genres. Next, we're going to discuss subgenres that may interest you. Some you probably heard of, others you haven't. Then we're going to move on to moods within certain genres and the target audience that maybe that specific genre was made for.
Last but not least, we are going to give you a little quiz. So a little vocab recap for you guys. See what you can take away from this one particular episode and a little quiz at the end. And don't forget all of our quizzes, vocabulary, and even all the movies we mentioned in this podcast, which there will be a lot. They can be found in the show notes. Quick fire translations. Nick is going to give you the English and I'm going to give you the Chinese.
Comedy.
喜剧
Action.
动作
Sci-fi.
Science fiction 叫科幻片
Horror.
恐怖片
Thriller.
惊悚片
Crime.
犯罪片
Romance.
浪漫片
Animation.
动画 I also think it's worthy to remind ourselves that a lot of movies, or most of the movies, actually belong to more than one genres. There are a lot of crossover genres, and we can't possibly cover them all in this episode. Otherwise, this is going to be 50 minutes long.
Let's start off with comedy. So the first subgenre within comedy, one that I really love, is a buddy cop. So Benai, what's a buddy? Are you my buddy?
I think so. A buddy is a slang for good friends.
Yep.
Very close friends. And actually, it is more commonly used than people may think. So, especially between guys, I hear people referring to each other like my buddy a lot.
Yeah.
Would you say so?
Yeah, and you could also use it for somebody who's not too good of a friend as well. Even somebody you just may be like, hey, buddy. It's just a way to disarm people, I think, and it's a nice way to greet somebody.
Cop is a slang for police officer.
Yep.
So, buddy cop, in short, is 警匪片. But more specifically, 这几个警匪是好朋友.
Yeah, and sometimes in those movies, they start off as enemies, right? I don't want to be your partner. But then they grow to respect each other, and they both think that they're, pretty good cops.
You're a good cop.
You're a good cop, Benai. Something like that, right? They give each other a high five at the end when they catch the bad guy. And definitely one of those movies I think a lot of you will know would be Rush Hour.
尖峰时刻. Oh my god, I can't wait for the next one.
Yeah, well, they're going to be really old. They're going to both have gray hair and maybe be in a wheelchair, but you'd still go and see it because, Chris Tucker, Jackie Chan, both really funny. Those are classic buddy cop movies. This
is kind of beside the point, but Chris Tucker has not come out with new movies for a very long time. So if when Rush Hour 4, I think it's number 4, does come out, I would definitely be in the theater to watch it.
Slapstick is another form of comedy, and it's one that usually involves some ridiculous or over-the-top antics. Benai, can you think of any example, or you can give the Chinese translation for a slapstick comedy?
Oh yeah, the name itself is just funny. Slap is the 拍打. Stick is your 棍子, right? So 棍子乱拍乱打. Slapstick humor is like 滑稽小丑式的幽默。So this is my examples are not necessarily movies, but you guys can think about Tom and Jerry. 汤姆猫与杰利鼠. So that's a classic example of slapstick humor.
Yeah, Tom and Jerry is a really good example of how it's actually pretty violent when you think about it. There may be no blood in it, but they keep banging each other over the head, trying to trap each other. And that's a hallmark of a slapstick type of film. One movie in particular, or a director I can think about, Benai definitely knows, and I'm sure a lot of you know him as well, is Stephen Chow.
So Stephen Chow, 周星驰. One of the movies that is popular not only in the East but also in the West is 少林足球. What's that called in English?
Shaolin Soccer.
Not very original.
No, it's not. But I think actually the first one was Kung Fu Hustle was really the big one that made the crossover into the United States.
Kung Fu Hustle, I believe it is called Gong Fu.
Yeah, maybe it's just that, right? It's about this guy who discovers, or he thinks that he's a super kung fu master, but he's kind of really just a loser. But then when he becomes an upright and good person, he can save the villagers from an evil gang.
Yeah, the similarity is that both Tom and Jerry and Stephen Chow's Kung Fu Hustle share is that there is violence, they're comedic, they are juvenile and ridiculous.
Yeah, over the top.
Over the top, too much.
Yeah.
But it's so funny that you can't stop watching it.
Exactly. Crime is another genre that is pretty popular, and one of the subgenres within crime is a heist film.
Heist. That's a good word for 抢劫片.
A stick-em-up type of movie where there's some type of robbery or there's a theft going on. Maybe they are trying to just rob a bank, but other times there could be a more elaborate plan where they're breaking into a high-security vault. One particular series I can think about of films would be the Ocean's 11 movies.
瞒天过海. One of my mom's favorite movies.
It's a lot of people's favorite because of the star-studded cast.
Star-studded cast. 它指的是众星云集的卡司啊. So what are the big names in Ocean's 11?
Matt Damon, Brad Pitt, George Clooney, Julia Roberts is in the second one. So there's a lot of big names in there. Sometimes those movies, star-studded ones, sometimes they're flops, right? Maybe they all don't have chemistry with each other, but the Ocean's 11, that series, it's very entertaining. Mob movies is a very popular genre here in the United States, I think, especially because when we think about mobsters, the history is actually pretty recent. Mostly the original mob movies way back were about the Italian-American mobsters out in New York City. Some of these people were real gangsters, real criminals. And that's definitely a genre of crime film that a lot of people gravitate towards.
So in mobster films, sometimes it doesn't even have to be based out of American histories. They could be cities in Russia, in Japan, in Hong Kong, or Italy.
Yeah, it's really an international theme. It's something that I think a lot of people can at least relate to or that they know about because most places in the world have suffered from this type of crime.
Another subgenre that is hiding in crime is something that actually a lot of Chinese people love, but they just don't know the name. Think about Sherlock Holmes. They are called whodunit. So how would you define what's a whodunit?
Yeah, a whodunit is a crime film where you, the audience, is being fed clues throughout the film. So somebody is usually murdered within the first, second scene of the movie really quickly. All of the characters are introduced right away, and throughout the film, you're fed all these different clues. Usually, if it's a good whodunit, at one point you think it's this person, you think it's that person, and then by the end, if it's a really good one, you thought you really knew who it was, and then maybe there's some twist at the end, and it's the old lady that you never expected, something like that. That's how I would define a whodunit. I think about some characters that would be really quintessential. What's one, Benai, that you think in a whodunit, a character that kind of, in each whodunit, they gotta have this type of character?
A quintessential character in whodunit? Well, it has to be the extraordinary detective. Someone who has kind of an odd character or personality, but he is gonna be the detective that crack the case. One movie I'm sure a lot of you actually know is called Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. A lot of her novels have been adapted into films, and it's a classic whodunit type of movies. Sci-fi, which is short for science fiction. Inside this genre, I really want to touch upon this dystopian future movies.
Beep, I am a robot come to take over the world.
Exactly.
Yeah, so when we think about dystopian future, that's a subgenre that has become really popular in the past few years, especially with the rise of technology the way that it is today. One of the common themes that we see there is machines rising up or the complete destruction of the world as we know it. Benai, how would you define dystopian future? Can you think of any good examples of those types of films?
Oh yeah, Mad Max, 疯狂麦斯. But full disclaimer, I actually have never fully watched any of Mad Max movies.
Not even the new one?
No, I've seen clips of it, but I've never fully seen the entire movies.
It's just one long car chase.
I can imagine. I just remember their clothes. I remember the dusty roads and the mechanical trucks or cars that they're driving that seem very dangerous.
Yeah, and with these dystopian films, usually there's a limited amount of resources and people are fighting over it, whether that's water, whether it's food, or in some of the Mad Max movies, gasoline. But that's a really common theme in the dystopian future film.
I want to talk about the word dystopian because before we know this word, we have to know the word utopia, which is 乌托邦. Imagine 乌托邦 utopia like the Western version of 桃花源. So dystopian, is anti-utopia. The world that is the opposite of what you want it to be. It is not perfect. It is far from perfect. It is bleak, and you don't want to live there.
Yeah, and bleak would mean that there's very little hope in the world.
Here's a recommendation for you, one that we watched on Netflix. It's not a movie, but a series on Netflix called Altered Carbon, called 碳变, 木炭的碳, 变化的变.
Yeah, and it's an interesting show, I think, especially now with the rise of artificial intelligence, the idea that maybe we can transfer our consciousness from one body to the other. So there's all sorts of questions in dystopian future sci-fi films about morality, ethics, about human nature. Benai, when you think about animation, what type of films stand out the most to you?
When I think about animation, the type of film that comes out in my head first is Pixar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Pixar has to be probably the most known animation studio in the world at this point. Their movies tend to always be a really big hit, not just with critics, but with audiences, young and old. And what separates, or what used to separate them when they first came out, was they were the studio that was making computer animated type films.
Yeah, actually, one of my students is an animator, and sometimes we watch little clips here and there in our class, and we just kind of gush over how good their animation is. But let us not forget, Japan also has a very good animation studio, which you love.
Yeah, Studio Ghibli is one of my favorite animation studios. I've always loved Miyazaki's films, and I think what I love most about them is that, for the most part, their movies are done by hand, and I think you can really see the detail in those movies.
Yeah, the artistic design of his films are amazing. So one that is always ingrained in my, basically defines Studio Ghibli for me is 神隐少女, Spirited Away.
Yeah.
You know what always confused me with the word Ghibli? Because in Chinese we call it 吉卜力. So when I see the English, I feel like it should be called Ghibli.
I believe it's pronounced Ghibli, and it actually comes from an Italian word, which means a desert wind. So Miyazaki has all sorts of themes in his film. If you've watched his movies, you can see even sometimes in the setting that he has some buildings or some cities that look actually really European. He named it that way because he wanted his studio to be like the desert wind of change through the animation industry in Japan.
Thank you, Nerdy Nick. That was
You're welcome.
Great piece of information that everybody needs.
Yeah, but I just kicked her because she was falling asleep there.
So far, we've covered comedy, crime, sci-fi, animation. Let's talk about something a little bit scary.
Horror films are defined by how scary they are. Usually they may be a bit gory or a bit bloody, but there are horror movies that have a little bit of comedy to them as well.
Exactly. Which is why I want to bring you guys this subgenre in horror called zombie comedy or zombie in general.
I like to call that a zombie.
Zombie.
That's not a real word.
It's not a real word. It's zombie plus comedy, but zombie, I like that. I'll take that.
First ones that I remember was Shaun of the Dead.
活人生吃.
Movie about the zombie apocalypse coming and two guys who you think would be the first to die, they somehow survive. And of course, being English, they end up in a pub. That's where they try to wait it out.
But you guys don't forget, zombie movies doesn't only belong in Hollywood. In Hong Kong, they have zombie movies too. They're just a little bit different. They wear some Qing dynasty costume and they hop.
The hopping zombies. I didn't know that that was a thing until I saw it on TV when I was living in Taiwan.
So, Nick, what is something that you will watch when you're just chilling at home?
Chilling at home, hanging out, I'll watch crime movies because I think that they keep me entertained not only with the plot, but there's a little bit of action in there too. Too much action where it's just explosion after explosion. That kind of gets boring after a while.
There are some movies that I would particularly not watch at home. I would prefer to watch in a theater is some action adventure that have very good special effects. So the first thing that comes to my mind would be some of the Marvel movies.
Yeah, that's a great example of a big budget film, something that has a lot of special effects and one that you really won't want to miss in the theaters because you want to see those those special effects on the big screen and also hear it with the great sound system that, usually comes with watching a movie in the theaters.
There are particular kinds of genres that when they are being made, they are designed for a particular kind of target audience. Think about some of the high school or college films. So you will call them, what's the name again?
Coming of age.
That's right, 高校片. 辣妹过招, Mean Girls is a classic coming of age for me growing up. In coming of age movies, you can see some quintessential characters like the pretty girls, the athletic, handsome guy, the nerdy kid.
Yeah, sometimes those athletic guys can also be known as the jock, right? So they may be a bully and they may pick on the nerd. And so there's, that character who's stepped on and beaten up, and you root for that character to achieve whatever they're going to achieve. Maybe they're trying to make the sports team or they're trying to get the popular girl. So with coming of age films, you definitely see usually high school or young adult people kind of exploring what it means to be out in the real world. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Fluent Friends. We hope that you've learned something about genres, about movies and films, not just what Benai and I like or dislike, but also how to define it a little bit better.
Just reviewing some of the big words that we learned today. There are some words that are more beginner friendly, some are a little bit more advanced. Why don't we start with some of that vocabulary?
Genre.
种类
Plot.
情节或故事
Character.
角色
Audience.
观众
Ridiculous.
荒谬的
Special effects.
特效
Big budget films.
高成本的电影
Clue.
线索 Some of the more advanced vocabularies.
Crack the case.
破案
So when you think about a whodunit, some type of detective film, when they finally solved the case, when they know who committed the crime, they cracked the case. Quintessential.
Great word. It means 典型精髓的
Bleak.
苍凉凄凉的 When we talk about the dystopian films.
There's very little hope in the future in those films. Star-studded.
众星云集
Infamous.
恶名昭彰的
Crossover.
跨种类或混合种类的 So here's a little homework for you guys. You guys probably know the movie called Godfather, 教父 The homework is for you to look at this slang or this thing that they say in the movie called sleeping with the fishes. Is that what they say?
Yeah, you're going to sleep with the fishes, yeah.
Yeah, you're going to sleep with the fishes. So as a homework, just Google it. What does it mean to say sleep with the fishes in The Godfather?
I'll give you a hint. It's not a good thing. You don't want to be sleeping with the fishes.
No, you don't. Thank you for making this far into the episode. Just don't forget, find us on Substack, our newsletter, or find us on Instagram at fluentfriends.tw.
Thanks, everyone, and see you in the next show.